The gunshot echoed through the quiet night, sending birds scattering from their roosts as Nora Lawson clutched her younger sister's trembling hand. At 18, Nora had never imagined she would be fleeing through the darkness with 16-year-old Abigail, terror gripping their hearts as they left behind the only home they had known since their mother died 2 years ago. "We can't stop, Abby," Nora whispered urgently, her breath forming small clouds in the cool September air of 1875. "If Vernon finds us, he'll kill us both." Abigail nodded, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged face. "I know, I'm just so tired, Nora." The two sisters had been running for hours, ever since their stepfather Vernon Blackwell had returned home in a drunken rage. When he had discovered the money missing from his lockbox money Nora had been secretly saving to help them escape, he had flown into a fury unlike anything they'd seen before. The bruises on Nora's wrist were already darkening, evidence of his vice-like grip before she'd managed to break free. When he'd reached for his gun, the sisters had fled into the night with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the small pouch of coins Nora had managed to grab. "Just a little further," Nora encouraged, though she had no idea where they were headed. Jefferson, Texas was behind them now, the small frontier town where they'd lived since their mother had married Vernon 3 years ago. Ahead lay nothing but wilderness and uncertainty. The moon provided just enough light for them to navigate the rough path leading away from town. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf made them jump, imagining Vernon's hulking shadow right behind them. He was the town's blacksmith, a respected man in public, a monster behind closed doors. No one would believe what he was capable of, especially not against the word of 2 orphaned girls. "Nora, look," Abigail suddenly whispered, pointing ahead. In the distance, a warm light glowed through the trees. As they drew closer, the sisters could make out a small cabin, smoke rising from its chimney despite the late hour. A horse nickered softly from a nearby corral. "Should we?" Abigail's voice trailed off, uncertainty clear in her tone. Nora hesitated. Approaching a stranger's home in the middle of the night was dangerous, but they had few options. The temperature was dropping, and they needed shelter. Vernon wouldn't expect them to stop so close to town. He would likely assume they'd try to reach the next settlement. "We'll just peek through the windows first," Nora decided. "If it looks safe, maybe we can ask for help." They approached cautiously, staying low to the ground. The cabin was small but sturdy, built from rough-hewn logs with a small covered porch. As they crept closer, they heard a man's voice singing softly, accompanied by the gentle strumming of a guitar. Reaching the window, Nora carefully lifted her head to peer inside. A man sat with his back to them, facing the fireplace. He appeared to be alone, his tall frame relaxed in a wooden chair as his fingers moved skillfully across the guitar strings. His dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and beside him on the floor lay a wide-brimmed hat, a cowboy's hat. Before Nora could decide what to do, Abigail's foot caught on a root. She stumbled, knocking over a stack of firewood piled against the cabin wall. The crash was deafening in the quiet night. Inside, the music stopped abruptly. The man rose swiftly, setting aside the guitar and reaching for something likely a gun. "We should run," Abigail whispered frantically, but it was too late. The cabin door swung open and the man stepped onto the porch, a rifle held carefully in his hands. He was younger than Nora had expected, perhaps in his mid-20s, with a face that might have been handsome if not set in such a stern expression. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice deep but controlled. "Show yourself or I'll shoot." Nora took a deep breath and slowly stood, keeping Abigail behind her. "Please don't shoot. We mean no harm." The man's eyes widened slightly as he took in the sight of the 2 bedraggled young women. "What in God's name are you doing skulking around my property at this hour?" "We need help," Nora said, trying to keep her voice steady despite her fear. "My sister and we're in trouble." He studied them for a long moment, his eyes taking in their disheveled appearance, the fear evident in their faces, and Nora realized with a jolt the bruises visible on her wrist where her sleeve had pulled back. Slowly, he lowered the rifle. You'd better come inside, he said finally, his tone softening. Whatever trouble you're in, you won't solve it standing in the cold. Nora hesitated, still wary. The man seemed to understand her reluctance. Name's Ross Emerson, he offered, stepping back to give them space. I've got coffee on the stove and no interest in harming two young ladies, but I won't force you inside if you'd rather keep running to wherever it is you're headed. Something in his direct gaze made Nora believe him. She glanced at Abigail, who gave a small nod. I'm Nora Lawson, she said cautiously. This is my sister, Abigail. Ross nodded once, holding the door open wider. Come on in, Miss Lawson. Looks like you both could use a warm drink and a safe place to rest. As they stepped into the warmth of the cabin, Nora couldn't help but wonder if they were making a terrible mistake or finding the sanctuary they so desperately needed. Only time would tell if Ross Emerson was truly the help they sought or just another danger in a world that suddenly seemed full of them. The interior of the cabin was simple but neat, with a table and chairs, a small cookstove, and a few pieces of sturdy furniture. A curtain partitioned off what Nora presumed was a sleeping area. The walls were decorated with a few framed sketches of landscapes, surprisingly delicate for such a rugged setting. Sit, Ross said, gesturing to the chairs by the table. He set his rifle in a rack near the door, then moved to the stove where a coffee pot sat. It's not fancy, but it's hot. The sisters sat close together, both still tense and ready to flee at the first sign of trouble. Nora kept her eyes on Ross as he poured 3 cups of coffee, assessing him with the wariness of someone who had learned the hard way that men were not always what they seemed. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his movements suggesting the easy strength of someone accustomed to physical labor. His face was tanned from the sun, with clear blue eyes that seemed to notice everything. Despite his rough appearance, the worn clothes, the stubble on his jaw, there was something measured and thoughtful about him that didn't match Nora's image of a typical frontier man. Sugar? He asked, holding up a small container. Yes, please, Abigail answered before Nora could speak. Thank you. Ross set the cups before them, then pulled his own chair out, turning it around to sit with his arms resting on the back. He made no move to come closer than necessary, seeming to understand their nervousness. Now, he said after taking a sip of his coffee, suppose you tell me what brings 2 young women to my doorstep in the middle of the night looking like they've seen the devil himself. Nora exchanged a glance with Abigail. How much should they reveal? If Vernon came looking, would this man turn them over? We're running away, Nora said finally, deciding that a partial truth was safest. From Jefferson, we need to get somewhere else, somewhere far from here. Jefferson's a good 5 miles back, Ross observed. You've been walking all night. Yes, Abigail said. We couldn't stay there anymore. Ross's eyes dropped to the bruises on Nora's wrist, now clearly visible in the lamp light. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Your father do that? He asked quietly. Stepfather, Nora corrected, unconsciously pulling her sleeve down. He's not a good man, Ross nodded slowly. And I'm guessing there's no law in Jefferson that would take your side against him, Nora gave a bitter laugh. Sheriff Duncan plays cards with him every Friday night. Besides, Vernon is respected in town. We're just troublesome girls who don't appreciate everything he's done for us. He was going to kill us tonight, Abigail blurted out suddenly. He had a gun. He said we'd stolen from him and he was going to teach us a final lesson. Abby, Nora said sharply, afraid they'd shared too much. It's the truth, Abigail insisted. I'm tired of pretending. Ross set his cup down carefully. Did you steal from him? Nora lifted her chin. I took money I'd earned sewing for Mrs. Patterson. He found my hiding place and assumed I'd stolen it from his lockbox. Not that it matters, he'd already spent most of my earnings on whiskey. I see. Ross was silent for a moment, studying them both. And where were you planning to go? San Antonio, Nora said. I have a friend there, someone I wrote to from school before Mother died. She said I could find work as a seamstress. That's a fair distance, Ross remarked, and dangerous for 2 young women traveling alone. We don't have a choice, Nora said firmly. Ross stood up suddenly, causing both sisters to tense, but he merely walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. You can stay here tonight, he said without turning around. I've got a bedroll I can set up by the fire for myself. You two can take the bed behind that curtain. Why would you help us? Nora couldn't keep the suspicion from her voice. You don't know us. Ross turned back to face them, his expression unreadable. Let's just say I've got no love for men who raise their hands to women and children. Besides, he added, a slight smile softening his features, my mother raised me better than to turn away folks in need. We can pay, Nora offered quickly, reaching for the small pouch of coins. Ross shook his head. Keep your money, you'll need it for your journey. He paused, seeming to consider something. In the morning, we can figure out a safer way to get you to San Antonio than walking. Relief washed over Nora, so intense she felt light-headed. For the first time since fleeing Vernon's house, she allowed herself to believe they might actually escape. Thank you, she said, the words feeling inadequate. Ross simply nodded, then moved to a trunk in the corner. I'll get that bedroll set up. There's water in the basin if you want to wash up. As he busied himself with preparations, Abigail leaned close to Nora. Do you think we can trust him? She whispered. Nora watched as Ross efficiently arranged his bedding near the hearth, keeping his distance and his movements open and non-threatening. I think so, she whispered back. For tonight at least. And right now, tonight is all that matters. That night, despite their exhaustion, Nora slept fitfully. The bed was comfortable enough, far better than the hard ground they would have slept on otherwise, but every creak and rustle from the cabin had her tensing, expecting to see Vernon's furious face. Several times she rose to peek through the curtain, only to see Ross sleeping peacefully on his bedroll, the fire casting flickering shadows across his features. By morning, dark circles shadowed her eyes, but determination had solidified in her heart. They would reach San Antonio one way or another. They had to. Dawn was just breaking when she heard Ross moving about the cabin, the soft clink of cookware as he prepared breakfast. Nora slipped from the bed, careful not to wake Abigail, who had finally fallen into deep sleep, and pushed the curtain aside. Ross glanced up from the stove. Good morning, he said quietly. Hope I didn't wake you. No, Nora replied, running a hand through her tangled hair. I was already awake. He nodded toward a pot on the stove. Coffee's fresh if you want some. Breakfast will be ready soon, just bacon and johnny cakes, I'm afraid. That sounds wonderful, Nora said truthfully. They hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, watching as Ross worked. In the clear morning light, she could study him more carefully. His movements were efficient and practiced, suggesting a man accustomed to caring for himself. There was a scar on his forearm, visible where he'd rolled up his sleeves, and another smaller one at his temple, partially hidden by his hair. You live out here alone? She asked, breaking the silence. Yep, he answered, flipping the johnny cakes in the pan. Going on 3 years now. What do you do for work, I mean? Ross glanced at her, a slight smile touching his lips. Curious, aren't you? Nora felt her cheeks warm. If you're helping us, I should know something about you. Fair enough. He transferred the bacon to a plate. I raise horses. Break and train them for sale. Do a bit of hunting and trapping in the winter months. Is that how you got those scars, from horses? His smile widened slightly. You don't miss much, do you? This one, he touched the one on his arm, was from a particularly ornery stallion. The one up here, he gestured to his temple, was a gift from a Comanche brave about 5 years back before the reservations. Nora's eyes widened. You fought Indians? Not if I could help it, Ross replied seriously, bringing the plates to the table. That particular encounter was a misunderstanding over whose deer it was. We both thought we'd shot it. He had a better argument, considering his arrow was in it and my bullet had missed, but I was younger and more foolish then. Despite everything, Nora found herself smiling. There was something disarming about his frank manner. Should I wake Abigail? She asked, glancing toward the curtain. Let her sleep if she needs it, Ross said. Food will keep. He sat down across from her, his expression growing serious. We should talk about getting you both to San Antonio. Nora nodded, her anxiety returning. How far is it? About 300 miles, Ross said. Not a journey to undertake lightly, especially with winter coming on. Nora's heart sank. But we have to go. If we stay near Jefferson, Vernon will find us eventually. Ross studied her for a moment, then nodded. I agree, but you'll need more than just determination to make it safely. He took a sip of his coffee. There's a stagecoach that runs from Marshall to San Antonio, stopping at several towns along the way. Marshall's about 20 miles east of here. 20 miles? Nora echoed, dismayed. I can take you, Ross said simply. I've got a wagon and 2 good horses. We could leave today, reach Marshall by tomorrow, and see you both on that stage by afternoon. Nora stared at him, surprised by the offer. You do that. But what about your ranch, your horses? My neighbor Joe Wilkins checks on things when I'm gone. I was planning to ride into Marshall soon anyway for supplies. He shrugged. It's no great hardship. The generosity was almost overwhelming. After years of Vernon's cruelty, kindness from a stranger was hard to trust, and yet something about Ross Emerson's straightforward manner made Nora want to believe him. Why are you helping us? She asked again, needing to understand. Ross was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. When I was 12, my father died. My mother remarried a year later a man who seemed decent enough at first, but after a while he changed, started drinking, then started using his fists. His jaw tightened at the memory. No one stepped in to help. Everyone looked the other way because they didn't want to involve themselves in family matters. What happened? Nora asked softly. When I was 16, he beat my mother so badly she couldn't get out of bed for a week. That night I took her and we fled. We had nowhere to go, no money, nothing but the clothes on our backs. He met Nora's eyes. A stranger helped us, gave us shelter, food, and enough money to reach my uncle's home in Kansas. I never forgot that kindness. Understanding dawned on Nora. So this is you repaying that debt. Something like that, Ross acknowledged. Though I don't see it as a debt, more like passing along what was given to us when we needed it most. The curtain rustled behind them and Abigail emerged, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She looked younger than her 16 years, vulnerable in a way that strengthened Nora's resolve to protect her. Good morning, Ross greeted her. Hungry? Abigail nodded, her eyes darting between them. What are you talking about? Mr. Emerson has offered to take us to Marshall, Nora explained. There's a stagecoach there that can carry us to San Antonio. Abigail's face lit up with hope. Really? When? Today, if you're both up for it, Ross said, standing to fetch another plate. It's a day's journey to Marshall, so we'd camp on the trail tonight. What about him? Abigail asked, her voice dropping. What if he comes looking? Vernon doesn't know about Mr. Emerson or this cabin, Nora reassured her. He'll be searching in the wrong direction. And I know these woods better than most, Ross added, setting a plate before Abigail. We'll take paths that aren't well traveled. Abigail seemed satisfied with this, digging into her breakfast with the enthusiasm of youth. Nora watched her sister, grateful for her resilience. Then she looked at Ross, who was already planning their journey, listing supplies they would need. In the harsh light of morning, their situation was still desperate. They were fleeing from the only home they knew, with little money and an uncertain future awaiting them. But for the first time since their mother's death had left them at Vernon's mercy, Nora felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. After breakfast, preparations moved quickly. Ross packed provisions for the journey while instructing the sisters on what they should bring and what they could leave behind. Travel light, he advised. Take only what you truly need. We can purchase other necessities in Marshall before you board the stage. Nora had little to pack, just the small pouch of coins, a locket containing a miniature portrait of their mother, and a worn book of poetry that had been her most treasured possession since childhood. Abigail had even less, only a small wooden bird their father had carved for her before his death. While Ross hitched the horses to his wagon, the sisters washed the breakfast dishes and tidied the cabin, a small repayment for his kindness. Through the window, Nora watched him work. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew his strength and how to use it, yet there was a gentleness in how he handled the horses that spoke of a different kind of character than the men she'd known. I like him, Abigail said quietly, coming to stand beside her at the window. Nora gave her sister a warning look. He's helping us, Abby. Don't read more into it than that. I didn't mean it like that, Abigail protested. I just meant he seems good, not like Vernon, Nora softened. Yes, he does, but we still need to be careful, we don't really know him. Sometimes I think you don't trust anyone, Abigail sighed. Trust is a luxury we can't afford right now, Nora replied, more sharply than she intended. Seeing Abigail's hurt expression, she added more gently, once we're in San Antonio, safe and settled, then we can think about trusting people again. The wagon was ready by mid-morning. Ross had packed it efficiently, supplies and provisions in the back, with a space cleared for the sisters to sit comfortably. A canvas cover provided shelter in case of rain. We should get moving, he said, helping Abigail onto the wagon seat. I'd like to put as much distance between us and Jefferson as possible before nightfall. Nora hesitated before accepting his hand up to the wagon. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, which she quickly dismissed as a natural response to kindness after so much cruelty. Ross climbed up beside them, taking the reins. Stay low for the first few miles, he advised, just in case there are any searchers on the main roads. The sisters ducked down as directed, and Ross guided the wagon away from the cabin, taking a narrow trail through the trees rather than the wider path that led toward town. The wagon swayed and jolted over the rough ground, but the discomfort was a small price to pay for their growing distance from Vernon. After about an hour, when the cabin was far behind them and they'd seen no sign of pursuit, Ross allowed them to sit up. The day was clear and crisp, the September sun warming the chill from the air. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled, thick pine forests giving way to more open country with rolling hills covered in golden grass. It's beautiful, Abigail remarked, her eyes wide as she took in the vastness of the Texas countryside. That it is, Ross agreed. One of the reasons I settled here after the war. Seems like there's still space to breathe. You fought in the war. Nora asked, curious despite her determination to maintain emotional distance. Ross nodded, his eyes on the trail ahead. Joined up in '63 when I was 18, saw action at Chickamauga, Missionary Ridge, and a handful of smaller engagements, nothing I care to remember much. The shadow that crossed his face spoke of memories too painful to share with strangers. Nora understood that kind of pain, the sort that lived beneath the surface, emerging in quiet moments when defenses were down. Our father fought too, she offered, with the Texas Cavalry. He died at Pleasant Hill in '64. I'm sorry to hear that, Ross said simply. Too many good men lost on both sides. They rode in companionable silence for a while after that. Around midday, Ross stopped the wagon near a small creek to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried apples. The sisters stretched their legs, grateful for the break from the constant motion of the wagon. How much farther today? Abigail asked, dipping her hands in the creek to wash them. We'll keep going until dusk, Ross replied. There's a good camping spot about 10 miles ahead near the old Miller property. No one lives there anymore, but the well still has good water. As they prepared to continue their journey, the distant sound of hoofbeats made them all freeze. Ross quickly motioned for the sisters to hide in a thicket of brush near the creek. They complied immediately, hearts pounding as they crouched among the leaves. Ross busied himself with checking the horses' harnesses, appearing to be a traveler simply taking a rest. Minutes later, 2 riders appeared on the trail, men Nora didn't recognize, but whose demeanor immediately put her on edge. Afternoon, one called out as they approached Ross. Fine day for traveling. That it is, Ross replied easily, not looking up from his work. You heading east or west? The second man asked, his eyes scanning the area. East, Ross answered. Got business in Marshall. The first man dismounted, leading his horse to the creek for water. You haven't seen 2 young women on the road, have you? Sisters, one about 18, the other younger. Nora held her breath, her hand finding Abigail's in the hiding place. Can't say that I have, Ross said, finally looking up. They in some kind of trouble. Ran away from their pa in Jefferson, the man replied. Poor man's worried sick. They took some money too, so there's a reward for anyone who helps bring them home safe. That's so, Ross's voice revealed nothing of his thoughts. What's the father's name? Might be I'll keep an eye out on my travels. Vernon Blackwell, the second man supplied. Blacksmith in Jefferson, good man from what I hear, Ross nodded thoughtfully. I'll remember that, but like I said, haven't seen any young women on the trail. Been traveling since dawn, and you're the first folks I've come across. The men seemed satisfied with this answer. After watering their horses, they mounted up to leave. If you do spot them, Mr. Blackwell's offering $50 for their safe return, the first man added. They couldn't have gone far on foot. Appreciate the information, Ross replied. Safe travels to you? Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely did Ross signal for the sisters to emerge from hiding. Nora's legs trembled as she stood, both from the cramped position and from fear. He sent men looking for us, she whispered, horrified, and he's offering money. Bounty hunters, Ross said grimly, helping Abigail back to the wagon, or just opportunists. Either way, we need to be more careful. From now on, we'll stick to the back trails entirely. What if they find us? Abigail asked, her voice small. Ross's expression hardened. They won't, he said with such conviction that even Nora believed him. I know these lands better than any hired gun from Jefferson, and I have no intention of letting that man get his hands on either of you again. As they continued their journey, now on even smaller, less visible paths through the countryside, Nora found herself studying Ross with new eyes. He had lied without hesitation to protect them, turning down a substantial reward in the process. $50 was no small sum enough to buy provisions for months or make significant improvements to his small ranch. Yet he had chosen to help them instead. In a world where Nora had learned to expect the worst from people, Ross Emerson was proving to be the exception that challenged her carefully constructed defenses. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, promising rain before nightfall. Ross pushed the horses a bit harder, hoping to reach the abandoned Miller property before the weather turned. They arrived just as the first heavy drops began to fall, the old farmhouse a weathered silhouette against the darkening sky. It's not much, Ross said apologetically as he helped them down from the wagon, but the roof's still good in the main part of the house, and it'll keep us dry. The Miller place had clearly been abandoned for years. Nature was slowly reclaiming the building's vines crawled up the walls of the house, and part of the barn had collapsed entirely. But as Ross had promised, the central portion of the house remained sound, with solid walls and a roof that showed only a few small leaks. Ross quickly unloaded essential supplies from the wagon, then led the horses into the still-standing section of the barn where they would be sheltered from the coming storm. By the time he returned to the house, Nora had cleared debris from the main room and Abigail had arranged their bedrolls near the stone fireplace, which thankfully still had a functional chimney. I'll get a fire going, Ross said, bringing in an armload of relatively dry wood he'd found in the barn. It'll be a cold night otherwise. The rain intensified as evening fell, drumming on the roof and streaming down the cloudy windows. But inside, the small fire cast a warm glow over the room, and the simple meal of beans, dried beef, and biscuits Ross prepared on the portable stove from his supplies tasted better than anything Nora could remember eating in months. After dinner, as the storm raged outside, they sat around the fire listening to Ross tell stories of his travels across Texas and beyond. He had a gift for storytelling, painting vivid pictures with his words of the people and places he'd encountered. How did you end up with your ranch near Jefferson? Abigail asked during a lull in the conversation. You said you took your mother to Kansas after you left your stepfather. A shadow crossed Ross's face momentarily. My mother passed on about 5 years ago, pneumonia. After that, I drifted for a while. Worked cattle drives, did some scouting for the army. He poked at the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. When I had enough saved, I wanted a place of my own. Land was cheap near Jefferson after the war, and it suited my purpose: good grazing, plenty of water, and far enough from town to avoid too many neighbors. Do you ever get lonely? Abigail asked with the directness of youth. Abby, Nora chided. That's personal, Ross chuckled. It's all right. And yes, sometimes I do. But I've got my horses for company, and I make it into town often enough to remember why I prefer the quiet. His eyes met Nora's across the fire, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of similar souls who had learned to find safety in solitude. "What will you do in San Antonio?" Ross asked, shifting the conversation away from himself. Nora straightened, gathering her thoughts. "Find work, first of all. I'm a good seamstress, and from what my friend Julia writes, there's plenty of demand in a growing city. Once we're settled, I want Abigail to continue her education." "I want to be a teacher," Abigail added eagerly. "Before Mother died, I was doing well in school. The teacher said I had a gift for it." "A fine ambition," Ross said with approval. "What about you?" Nora asked suddenly. "What are your ambitions, Mr. Emerson?" He seemed surprised by the question, as if no one had asked him about his dreams in a long time. "I suppose I'd like to expand my horse breeding operation. I've been working on developing a line that combines the endurance of Mustangs with the strength of Eastern stock." He paused, then added more quietly, "And someday, I'd like a family. A real one, not the broken thing I grew up with." The honest vulnerability in his voice touched something in Nora. For all his capability and strength, Ross Emerson carried his own wounds, his own hopes that might never be realized. Later, as Abigail slept deeply, exhausted from the day's journey, Nora found herself unable to rest. The rain had eased to a gentle patter, and Ross had stepped outside to check on the horses one last time before turning in. When he returned, shaking water from his coat, he found Nora still sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. "You should get some sleep," he said softly, hanging his coat on a nail by the door. "Tomorrow will be another long day." "I know," she replied, not looking up. "I just can't seem to quiet my mind." Ross hesitated, then sat down on the other side of the fire, respecting her space. "Worried about your stepfather? That and everything else." She sighed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I keep wondering if we're doing the right thing, running away like this, if I'm leading Abigail into something worse than what we left behind." "From what I've seen and what you've told me, staying wasn't an option," Ross said firmly. "Not if you wanted to survive. But what awaits us in San Antonio? What if Julia isn't there anymore? What if I can't find work, or what if Vernon follows us?" The fears she'd been suppressing all day came tumbling out. "I'm responsible for Abigail. If anything happens to her because of choices I've made, Nora," Ross interrupted gently, using her given name for the first time. "You can't carry the weight of every possibility. All you can do is make the best decision with what you know right now." She looked up at him, struck by the wisdom in his words. "When I took my mother away from my stepfather," he continued, "I had no idea what awaited us. I was terrified. But I knew staying meant watching her die little by little under his fists, so we left and we faced each day as it came. And it worked out," Nora said. Ross's smile held a hint of sadness. "Not perfectly. We struggled. There were hungry nights and cold winters. But she lived 10 more years than she would have otherwise, and they were good years, free from fear." He leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "That's what you're giving Abigail, the chance at a life without fear. Whatever hardships come, that gift is worth it." His words washed over Nora like a balm, easing the tight knot of anxiety in her chest. For so long, she had carried her burdens alone, believing that sharing them would only make them heavier for someone else. But here, in this abandoned farmhouse with rain pattering on the roof, she felt the relief of being understood. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything." Ross nodded, understanding all that she couldn't put into words. "Try to rest now. I'll keep watch for a while." As Nora finally settled into her bedroll beside the sleeping Abigail, she found herself studying Ross's profile as he sat by the fire. In just over a day, this stranger had become their protector, guide, and confidant. It was dangerous to rely so much on someone she barely knew. Yet something told her that Ross Emerson was a rare thing in their harsh world, a good man who did right simply because it was right. With that comforting thought, she finally drifted into sleep. the sound of the rain and the occasional soft clink of Ross tending the fire forming a lullaby of unexpected safety. The second day of their journey dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean overnight. They set out early, Ross once again choosing less traveled paths that wound through thickets and across streams, avoiding the main roads where Vernon's men might be searching. By mid-morning, the landscape began to change, the rolling hills giving way to more settled country with occasional farms and small homesteads. They were drawing closer to Marshall, and Nora felt both relief and apprehension growing with every mile. Soon they would reach the stagecoach station, and their paths would diverge from Ross's a thought that left her with an unexpected hollowness. "We'll reach Marshall by early afternoon," Ross informed them as they stopped briefly to water the horses. "The stage to San Antonio leaves at 4 o'clock, according to the schedule I saw last month. That gives us time to purchase your tickets and any supplies you'll need for the journey." "How long will it take to reach San Antonio?" Abigail asked. "4 days with stops along the way," Ross replied. "The stage travels faster than we could by wagon, but it still takes time to cover that distance." 4 more days, Nora murmured, calculating their remaining funds. The stage tickets would take most of what they had, leaving precious little for establishing themselves in San Antonio. Ross seemed to read her thoughts. "I have some extra money set aside. I want you to take it." "No," Nora interrupted firmly. "You've done more than enough already. We won't take your money too." "It's not charity," Ross said, his voice equally firm. "Consider it an investment in your future. You can repay me when you're established in San Antonio." "And how would we do that?" Nora challenged. "You'll be hundreds of miles away in Jefferson." A strange expression crossed Ross's face. "I travel to San Antonio occasionally for horse business. I could check on you next time I'm there." The idea of seeing Ross again in the future sent an unexpected flutter through Nora's chest. She quickly suppressed it, focusing on practicality. "We'll manage with what we have," she insisted, "but thank you for the offer." Ross looked like he wanted to argue further, but something in her expression must have convinced him of her resolve. "At least let me buy you both a proper meal in Marshall before the stage leaves," he said instead. "You'll need your strength for the journey." To this, Nora agreed, and they continued on their way. As they approached Marshall, Ross guided the wagon toward a small grove of trees about a mile outside of town. "We'll leave the wagon here," he explained. "Better if we walk into town separately." 2 young women arriving with an unknown man might draw attention, especially if word has reached Marshall about Vernon's search. "What should we do?" Nora asked, anxiety returning at the thought of entering a town where Vernon might have contacts. "I'll go in first," Ross decided. "Check if there's any talk about missing girls from Jefferson. You two wait here for an hour, then follow this path into town." He pointed to a narrow trail. "It leads to the east side of Marshall, near the church. From there, make your way to Donovan's restaurant on Main Street. I'll meet you there at 2 o'clock. The plan was simple but sensible. Ross helped them down from the wagon, then unloaded a small pack with essentials they might need if they had to flee before reaching the restaurant. "If I'm not there by 2:30 or if you sense any danger, don't wait for me," he instructed, his expression grave. "Take this money, buy your tickets, and get on that stage." He pressed a small pouch into Nora's hands despite her earlier refusal, but she began to protest. "No arguments," Ross said firmly. "Your safety comes first. Promise me you'll use it if necessary." The intensity in his blue eyes made it impossible to refuse. "I promise," Nora said softly. Ross nodded, satisfied. "Good. With any luck, we'll have a peaceful meal and see you both safely on that stage as planned." He hesitated, as if wanting to say more, then simply tipped his hat and headed down the trail toward Marshall, soon disappearing among the trees. The sisters settled in to wait, finding a comfortable spot beneath an oak tree. Abigail passed the time by weaving grass stems into small figurines, a skill their mother had taught her years ago. Nora watched the path, her mind filled with worries about what might await them in town. "Do you think we'll ever see him again?" Abigail asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "Mr. Emerson, I don't know," Nora replied honestly. It's a long way from Jefferson to San Antonio. Abigail gave her a knowing look. I think he likes you. Don't be ridiculous, Nora said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. He's helping us because he's a decent man, that's all. I've seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching, Abigail persisted with the confidence of youth. And you look at him the same way sometimes. That's enough, Abby, Nora said firmly. Even if there were feelings, which there aren't, it wouldn't matter. Our lives are taking us in different directions. Abigail sighed dramatically. You're always so practical. Sometimes I think you forget how to hope for good things. The words struck uncomfortably close to the truth. When had Nora stopped allowing herself to hope? Perhaps when their father died, or when their mother remarried Vernon, or during those long, dark months after their mother's death when Vernon's true nature revealed itself. Somewhere along the way, survival had replaced dreams as her primary focus. Hope is a luxury, she said finally. Right now, we need to focus on reality. But as they waited for the appointed time to make their way into Marshall, Nora found herself wondering what it might be like to stay to accept Ross's help without the pressure to leave immediately, to see what might develop between them given time and different circumstances. It was a dangerous line of thinking, one she quickly suppressed. Their plan was set. San Antonio awaited. When the hour had passed, they gathered their few belongings and set out along the trail Ross had indicated. The path was well worn but quiet, with no other travelers in sight. As promised, it led them to the eastern edge of Marshall, emerging near a white steepled church that anchored that side of town. Marshall was significantly larger than Jefferson, with broader streets and more substantial buildings. The sisters made their way carefully toward Main Street, Nora constantly scanning for any sign of Vernon's men or anyone taking undue interest in them. But the townspeople were busy with their own affairs, barely sparing a glance for two modestly dressed young women walking purposefully through town. They found Donovan's restaurant without difficulty, a tidy establishment with large windows and a sign advertising home cooking at fair prices. Through the glass, Nora could see that the lunch crowd was thinning, with several empty tables available. And there, sitting at a corner table with his back to the wall and a clear view of the door, was Ross. Relief washed over her as they entered the restaurant. Ross stood as they approached, pulling out chairs for them with a smile that seemed genuinely glad to see them safe. Everything go smoothly. He asked quietly after they were seated. Nora nodded. No one paid us any attention. What about you? Did you hear anything? Nothing about missing girls from Jefferson, Ross confirmed. I checked at the stage coach office. The 4 o'clock stage is running on schedule, and there are seats available. For the first time in days, Nora felt the tight knot of tension in her chest begin to loosen. Perhaps they really would escape Vernon's reach after all. A waitress approached their table, a plump, cheerful woman with graying hair pinned neatly beneath a white cap. "What can I get for you folks today?" she asked, her eyes curious as they took in the trio, clearly wondering about their relationship but too professional to ask. Ross ordered for all of them after confirming the sisters' preferences: roast beef with potatoes and vegetables, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. It was more food than Nora and Abigail had seen at one meal in months, and when it arrived, they had to remind themselves to eat slowly, like proper young ladies rather than starving refugees. The meal was filled with light conversation, carefully avoiding any mention of their true circumstances in case of listening ears. Ross told them about Marshall's history, pointing out buildings of interest visible through the restaurant windows. Abigail, more relaxed than Nora had seen her in ages, asked questions about the town and shared observations of her own. Watching her sister's animated face, Nora felt a surge of fierce protectiveness. This was how Abigail should always be: curious, engaged, unafraid. The thought strengthened her resolve to reach San Antonio and build a new life where Abigail could grow into the woman she was meant to become. As they finished their dessert, Ross glanced at the clock on the wall. "We should head to the stage coach office soon to purchase your tickets. The stage will start boarding at 3:30. The reminder that their time together was coming to an end cast a shadow over the meal's pleasant atmosphere. Nora nodded, reaching for her reticule where she kept their money, including the additional funds Ross had insisted she take. "I'll settle the bill," Ross said, standing. "Meet me outside in a few minutes." While he went to pay, the sisters gathered their few belongings and made their way to the front of the restaurant. Through the window, Nora could see the busy main street, people going about their business under the afternoon sun. Somewhere in that crowd, they would soon disappear, leaving behind both the horrors of Vernon's house and the unexpected sanctuary Ross had provided. The thought brought an ache she hadn't anticipated. Ross joined them moments later, and together they walked toward the stage-coach office several blocks away. The streets were busier now, with wagons and riders creating a steady flow of traffic. Ross kept them to the boardwalk, positioning himself between the sisters and the street in a protective gesture that seemed instinctive rather than calculated. They were halfway to the stage-coach office when Nora heard a voice that made her blood run cold. "I'm certain I saw them heading this way," a man was saying as he emerged from a shop across the street. Two girls matching the description exactly. The speaker was Bill Thompson, Vernon's drinking companion and occasional assistant at the blacksmith shop. Beside him stood a marshal wearing a badge, looking skeptical but attentive. "Ross," Nora whispered urgently, gripping his arm. "That man across the street, he's from Jefferson. He knows us." Ross reacted instantly, guiding them into the narrow alley between a hardware store and a dressmaker's shop. "Stay here," he instructed. "I'll see what they're doing." "No," Nora protested. "If he sees you with us, he doesn't know me," Ross assured her. "I rarely go into Jefferson itself, just stay out of sight." Before Nora could argue further, Ross had stepped back onto the boardwalk, positioning himself where he could observe Thompson and the marshal while appearing to study the goods displayed in a shop window. Nora pulled Abigail deeper into the alley, her heart pounding. They had been so close to escape, so close to freedom, if Thompson had recognized them. Minutes later, Ross returned, his expression grim. "Thompson's telling the marshal that Vernon's stepdaughters ran away after stealing money. He's showing a photograph and offering a reward for information." "A photograph?" Nora gasped. "Of us?" Ross nodded. "Looks like one taken at a town social last year from what I could see. The marshal seems inclined to help. $50 is a lot of money for passing along information." "What do we do?" Abigail asked, her voice trembling. Ross thought quickly. "We can't risk the stage-coach office now. Thompson might check there and the station will be too public." He glanced up at the sky, gauging the time. "There's another option. A friend of mine, Daniel Wright, runs a freight business on the south side of town. He sends wagons to Nacogdoches regularly, and from there you could catch a different stage to San Antonio." "When does the next freight wagon leave?" Nora asked. "That's the problem, not until tomorrow morning." Ross ran a hand through his hair, thinking. "We need a safe place for you to stay tonight, somewhere Thompson won't look." "Could we go back to the wagon and continue on our own?" Nora suggested, though the thought of losing Ross's protection sent a spike of fear through her. Ross shook his head. "Too risky. Thompson and others might be watching the roads out of town." He made a decision. "There's a widow named Mrs. Caldwell who runs a small boarding house on Pine Street. She's a good woman, discreet, and she owes me a favor. We can ask if she has a room where you can stay tonight." It was their best option, and they all knew it. Keeping to back alleys and side streets, Ross led them through Marshall, carefully avoiding Main Street where Thompson might still be searching. The boarding house, when they reached it, was a modest two-story building with a small garden in front, set back from the street and partially hidden by oak trees. Mrs. Caldwell proved to be exactly as Ross had described, a kind-faced woman in her 60s with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. When Ross briefly explained that the sisters needed a place to stay without questions being asked, she simply nodded and showed them to a small but clean room at the back of the house. "No one will bother you here," she assured them. "And if anyone comes asking, I haven't seen any young ladies matching your description." Nora thanked her profusely, but Mrs. Caldwell waved it off. "Mr. Emerson helped my son when he was in trouble a few years back," she explained. I don't forget kindnesses like that. Once they were settled in the room, Ross outlined the plan for the following day. I'll speak with Daniel tonight, arrange for you to travel with his freight wagon. It leaves at dawn, so you'll need to be ready early. The wagon will take you to Nacogdoches, and from there you can catch the southbound stage. What about you? Abigail asked. Will you come with us? A shadow crossed Ross's face. I can't leave my ranch unattended for that long. I need to return to Jefferson. Nora felt a pang of disappointment she couldn't entirely justify. Of course, Ross couldn't abandon his livelihood to escort them all the way to San Antonio. He had already done far more than anyone could reasonably expect. We understand, she said, keeping her voice steady. You've done more than enough already. Ross looked at her, something unspoken in his gaze. I'll come back this evening with some food for dinner and any news about Thompson's activities. Try to rest until then. After he left, the sisters settled into the small room, grateful for the unexpected sanctuary. Abigail lay down on one of the narrow beds and soon fell asleep, exhausted by the emotional strain of the day. Nora sat by the window, watching the street below through a gap in the curtains, her mind racing with plans and contingencies. What if Thompson discovered where they were hiding? What if the freight wagon was stopped and searched? What if they reached San Antonio only to find that Julia was no longer there, or unwilling to help? And beneath all these practical concerns lay a deeper unease, the knowledge that by this time tomorrow, they would likely never see Ross Emerson again. The thought brought a hollow feeling to her chest that she couldn't explain away as mere gratitude or dependency. In just 3 days, this quiet, steadfast man had become important to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. His strength, his integrity, his gentle consideration, these qualities had awakened something in Nora that she had thought died along with her mother. Trust, hope, perhaps even the first stirrings of affection. But such feelings were a luxury she couldn't afford, not when Abigail's safety and future depended on her clear thinking. Ross belonged to Jefferson and his horse ranch. She and Abigail were bound for San Antonio and whatever opportunities awaited them there. Their paths had crossed briefly, providentially, but now would diverge again. That was simply how life worked. Forcing her thoughts back to practical matters, Nora began mentally inventorying their possessions and planning what they would need for the journey ahead. It was safer than dwelling on what or who they would leave behind. Ross returned as the sun was setting, bringing a basket from Mrs. Caldwell's kitchen containing a hearty stew, fresh bread, and apple tarts for dessert. His expression was troubled as he set the food on the small table in the corner of the room. "What's wrong?" Nora asked immediately, recognizing the tension in his shoulders. "Thompson's still in town," Ross replied grimly. "He's shown that photograph all over Main Street, and now he's offering $100 reward, not 50. Abigail gasped. $100? Why would Vernon offer so much just to get us back? "It's not about getting you back," Nora said quietly, understanding dawning with sickening clarity. "It's about making sure we can't testify against him if we told the authorities what he's done." Ross nodded, confirming her theory. "He can't afford to have you free and talking. That makes this even more dangerous." He paced the small room, thinking. "I've arranged everything with Daniel. His wagon leaves at 5 tomorrow morning. You'll need to be at his freight office before then." "Will you come with us to the freight office?" Abigail asked, her voice small. "Of course," Ross assured her. "I'll be here at 4:30 to escort you. The streets should be mostly empty at that hour." They ate dinner together, the mood subdued by the news of Thompson's increased efforts to find them. Afterward, as Abigail helped herself to a second apple tart, Ross drew Nora aside to the window. "I have something for you," he said quietly, reaching into his coat. He withdrew a small pistol, well-maintained but clearly not new. "Do you know how to use one of these?" Nora nodded. Her father had taught her the basics before he went to war, believing every frontier woman should be able to defend herself if necessary. "It's loaded and ready," Ross continued, pressing the weapon into her hands. "Keep it with you, use it if you have to." The weight of the pistol was both reassuring and terrifying. "I pray it won't come to that," Nora murmured. As do I, Ross agreed, but I'll rest easier knowing you have it. His hand lingered on hers for a moment, warm and steady. Nora looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of the concern in his blue eyes, of the way the fading light caught the angles of his face. Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of feelings neither had put into words. Ross. She began, uncertain what she wanted to say. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted whatever might have followed. They moved apart as Mrs. Caldwell knocked softly on the door, entering with fresh towels and a pitcher of water. "Thought you might want these for the morning," she said, her eyes taking in the scene with perceptive kindness. "Early start tomorrow, I hear." "Yes, thank you," Nora replied, tucking the pistol discreetly into the pocket of her skirt. Mrs. Caldwell nodded and left, but the moment between Nora and Ross had passed. He cleared his throat, moving toward the door. "I should let you both get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we'll come early." "Will you be all right getting back to your wagon?" Nora asked. "What if Thompson sees you?" Ross smiled slightly. "I've spent years avoiding trouble. One man from Jefferson won't catch me off guard." He turned to go, then hesitated. "Nora, if circumstances were different." "I know," she said softly, saving him from having to finish the thought. "In another life, perhaps," he nodded, understanding passing between them. 4:30, he reminded her. "Be ready to leave immediately." After he left, Nora prepared for bed with mechanical movements, her mind elsewhere. She checked the pistol one last time before hiding it beneath her pillow, then extinguished the lamp. Beside her, Abigail was already asleep again, her breathing deep and even. In the darkness, Nora allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what might have been possible if Vernon had never entered their lives, if she and Abigail weren't fugitives, if Ross had met her under ordinary circumstances. The vision was so sweet, it almost hurt a simple life on his ranch, horses in the corral, children's laughter, Ross's steady presence beside her through the years. But such dreams were pointless. Their reality was one of danger and flight, of hard choices and uncertain futures. By this time tomorrow, Ross Emerson would be heading back to Jefferson while they journeyed south, their brief intersection of lives complete. With that sobering thought, Nora finally drifted into a restless sleep, the pistol hard beneath her pillow and Ross's face haunting her dreams. A soft knock at the door woke Nora from fitful sleep. She was instantly alert, reaching for the pistol before recognizing Mrs. Caldwell's whispered voice. "Miss Lawson, it's 4:15. Mr. Emerson said to wake you." "Thank you," Nora called softly. "We'll be down shortly." She roused Abigail and they dressed quickly in the dim light of a single candle, gathering their few possessions. The pistol went into the pocket of Nora's skirt, heavy but reassuring against her thigh. Downstairs, Mrs. Caldwell had coffee and biscuits waiting. "Eat something," she urged. "It's a long ride to Nacogdoches." They ate gratefully, though Nora's stomach was too knotted with tension to enjoy the food. Outside, the world was still dark, the streets of Marshall quiet except for the occasional distant bark of a dog. At precisely 4:30, there was another knock at the door. Mrs. Caldwell opened it to admit Ross, who looked as if he hadn't slept at all. His eyes quickly found Nora's, relief visible in them when he saw the sisters ready to depart. "Any trouble?" Nora asked as he stepped inside. Ross shook his head. "Streets are clear. Daniel's freight office is about 10 minutes from here, the wagon's being loaded now." Mrs. Caldwell handed each of them a small package wrapped in cloth. "Biscuits and jerky for the journey," she explained, "and God's blessing on you both." Nora thanked her with genuine warmth, touched by the woman's kindness to strangers. Then it was time to go. Ross checked the street once more before leading them out into the pre-dawn darkness, keeping to the shadows as they made their way through the sleeping town. The freight office was a large wooden building on the south edge of Marshall, with a yard full of wagons in various states of loading and repair. A lantern burned by the main door, illuminating a sign that read "Right Freight and Shipping." A tall man with a thick beard stood directing workers as they loaded crates into a large wagon. He turned as they approached, his face breaking into a smile at the sight of Ross. "Right on time," he said, stepping forward to shake Ross's hand. These the passengers? Ross nodded. Daniel, this is Nora and Abigail Lawson. Ladies, Daniel Wright, the most reliable freight man in East Texas. Daniel tipped his hat to the sisters. Pleasure. Ross here says you need discreet transportation to Nacogdoches. Yes, Nora confirmed. We're very grateful for your help. Any friend of Ross's is a friend of mine, Daniel replied easily. Wagon leaves in 15 minutes. You'll be riding with me up front. It's not fancy, but it's safer than the stage right now, from what I hear. Relief washed over Nora. They were so close to escape now. I'll just check that everything's secure, Daniel said, moving away to give them a moment of privacy. Ross turned to the sisters, his expression serious. Daniel will see you safely to Nacogdoches. The stage to San Antonio leaves from there at noon. He'll make sure you get your tickets. How can we ever thank you? Abigail asked, her eyes brimming with tears. Live well, Ross answered simply. Be happy, that's thanks enough. He reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope, handing it to Nora. This is the address of my ranch and a letter of introduction to a friend in San Antonio, Thomas Jenkins. He's a good man, owns a dry goods store. He'll help you get established, maybe offer work until you find a position as a seamstress. Nora took the envelope, her fingers brushing his. Why are you doing all this for us? She asked, the question that had been in her heart since he first offered them shelter. Ross's eyes met hers, direct and honest. Because it's right. Because you deserve a chance at a better life. He paused, then added softly, and because I've come to care what happens to you both. The admission hung in the air between them, unelaborated but unmistakable. In another time, under different circumstances, those words might have been the beginning of something. Now they were a goodbye. Daniel called from the wagon, "Time to go, ladies, sun'll be up soon." With a surge of emotion she couldn't fully contain, Nora stepped forward and embraced Ross. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder, "for everything." His arms came around her, strong and secure, holding her for a brief, precious moment before releasing her. "Take care of yourself, Nora Lawson," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "and your sister too." Abigail hugged him next with the uninhibited affection of youth. "Will we ever see you again?" she asked. "The world has a way of bringing people back together when it's meant to be," Ross answered, gently disengaging from her embrace. "Now go on, before that wagon leaves without you." With one last look at the man who had risked so much to help them, Nora took Abigail's hand and walked toward the waiting wagon. Daniel helped them up onto the seat beside him, arranging a blanket across their laps against the pre-dawn chill. As the wagon began to move, Nora turned to look back. Ross stood in the freight yard, a solitary figure in the gray light of approaching dawn. He raised his hand in farewell, and she returned the gesture, her heart heavy with what might have been. Then the wagon turned a corner, and he was gone from sight. Ahead lay Nacogdoches, then San Antonio, and whatever future they could build there. Behind remained the brief, bright connection with a man who had shown them kindness when they needed it most. Nora turned to face forward, squaring her shoulders. They were not safe yet. Vernon's reach was long, and until they were settled in San Antonio, danger would shadow their steps. But thanks to Ross Emerson, they had a chance, and for now, that would have to be enough. The journey to Nacogdoches was long but uneventful. Daniel Wright proved to be a friendly companion with a wealth of stories about his freight business and the characters he had encountered in his travels across Texas. He asked no questions about why two young women needed to travel discreetly, respecting their privacy just as Ross had promised. They arrived in Nacogdoches shortly before 11, giving them just enough time to purchase tickets for the southbound stagecoach. As promised, Daniel escorted them to the stage office and waited until they were safely aboard before taking his leave. "Ross is a good judge of character," he told Nora as they said their goodbyes. "If he thinks you're worth helping, that's good enough for me. Safe travels to you both." The stagecoach was crowded with travelers, a middle-aged couple returning from visiting relatives, a young minister heading to his first parish, a businessman with ledgers strapped to his valise, and an older woman accompanied by her maid. No one paid particular attention to the two sisters who kept to themselves in the corner seat. As the stage rumbled southward, Nora allowed herself to relax slightly for the first time in days. Each mile increased the distance from Vernon and his reach. By the time they reached San Antonio, they would be far enough away to begin anew. Abigail dozed against her shoulder, exhausted from their early start and the emotional strain of the past days. Nora remained awake, watching the Texas landscape roll by, her thoughts inevitably returning to Ross. She wondered what he was doing now, perhaps already on the road back to his ranch, or still in Marshall, concluding whatever business had brought him there in the first place. Had their paths crossed merely by chance, or was there some greater purpose to their meeting? Nora had never been one for romantic notions of fate, preferring to see the world in practical terms. Yet there was something about the timing of their encounter that seemed almost designed, as if some invisible hand had arranged for Ross to be there precisely when they needed him most. She touched the envelope in her pocket, containing his letter of introduction and address, a connection, however tenuous, to the man who had saved them. Perhaps someday, when they were settled and safe. No, she stopped the thought before it could fully form. Building fantasies of reunion would only lead to disappointment. Better to focus on the present, on establishing themselves in San Antonio, on creating a stable life for Abigail, on leaving Vernon and his cruelty firmly in the past. The stagecoach journey took exactly as Ross had predicted, 4 days of travel through the heart of Texas, with overnight stops at coaching inns along the route. The sisters kept to themselves, giving vague answers when fellow travelers inquired about their destination or purpose. Nora remained vigilant throughout, the pistol always within reach, but no sign of pursuit materialized. By the afternoon of the 4th day, the outskirts of San Antonio came into view. The city was larger than Jefferson or Marshall, with a mix of American and Mexican influences visible in its architecture and bustling streets. As the stage pulled into the central station, Nora felt a mix of trepidation and relief. They had made it this far now, the real work of building a new life would begin. Their first task was to locate Julia Parker, Nora's school friend who had offered them refuge. Julia's last letter had mentioned a boarding house on Crockett Street where she lived while working at a millinery shop nearby. With directions from a helpful station master, the sisters set out on foot, their few possessions carried in bundles. San Antonio was overwhelming after the smaller towns they were accustomed to. Wagons and carriages crowded the streets, merchants called out their wares from storefronts, and people of all descriptions hurried about their business. The sisters stayed close together, Nora leading the way with determined steps despite her exhaustion. The boarding house, when they found it, was a 3-story building painted a cheerful yellow, with flowering vines climbing trellises on either side of the front door. A brass plaque identified it as Mrs. Hoffman's Select Boarding House for Ladies. Nora straightened her travel-wrinkled dress and smoothed her hair before knocking. A moment later, the door opened to reveal a plump, middle-aged woman with a kind face and assessing eyes. "Yes?" she inquired, taking in their disheveled appearance. "Good afternoon," Nora said with as much dignity as she could muster. "We're looking for Miss Julia Parker. I believe she boards here. And who might be asking for her?" The woman, presumably Mrs. Hoffman, replied. "I'm Nora Lawson, an old school friend. This is my sister, Abigail. Julia wrote that she might be able to help us find accommodation in San Antonio." Mrs. Hoffman's expression softened slightly. "Miss Parker mentioned expecting friends. Please come into the parlor while I fetch her." The parlor was modestly but comfortably furnished, with several armchairs arranged around a small fireplace and a piano in one corner. Nora and Abigail sank gratefully into chairs, both too tired to maintain the facade of proper young ladies any longer. A few minutes later, the door opened and a young woman with auburn hair rushed in, her face lighting up at the sight of the sisters. "Nora, you made it," Julia exclaimed, crossing the room to embrace her old friend. "I've been so worried since I got your letter. Was the journey very difficult?" "More than we expected," Nora admitted, returning the embrace with genuine warmth. But we're here now and so grateful for your offer of help. Julia turned to Abigail, who had risen to her feet. And this can't be little Abby, you've grown so much since I last saw you. Abigail smiled shyly. It's been 3 years, Miss Parker. Julia, please, she corrected. We're practically family after all the time Nora and I spent together at school, over tea provided by Mrs. Hoffman. The sisters gave a carefully edited version of their journey, omitting Vernon's violence and their desperate flight. Julia listened sympathetically, asking few questions but clearly understanding there was more to the story than they were sharing. Well, the important thing is that you're here now, she said when they had finished. I've already spoken to Mrs. Hoffman. She has a small room available on the 3rd floor. It would be tight for 2, but manageable until you find something more suitable. We'll take it, Nora said immediately. And I need to find work as soon as possible. Our funds won't last long, Julia nodded thoughtfully. The shop where I work might need another seamstress. Mrs. Beaumont has been talking about expanding the millinery side of the business. I can introduce you tomorrow. That would be wonderful, Nora said gratefully. And schools for Abigail. I want her to continue her education if possible. There's a good girls' school not far from here, Julia assured them. Several of Mrs. Hoffman's younger boarders attend. We can inquire about enrollment next week. Everything was falling into place more smoothly than Nora had dared to hope. Within hours of arriving in San Antonio, they had accommodation, a potential job lead, and the prospect of schooling for Abigail. It seemed almost too good to be true after their harrowing escape and journey. That night, in the small but clean room under the eaves of Mrs. Hoffman's boarding house, Nora finally allowed herself to believe they might truly be safe. Vernon was hundreds of miles away, with no way of knowing where they had gone. Here in San Antonio, they could start fresh, build the life they deserved free from fear and violence. Yet as she drifted toward sleep, her thoughts turned once more to Ross Emerson and the quiet strength that had carried them through their darkest hours. In her half-dreaming state, she could almost feel the reassuring pressure of his hand on hers as he passed her the pistol, hear the low timbre of his voice as he promised they would be safe. In another life, perhaps, she had told him. But as sleep claimed her, a small, persistent voice in her heart whispered that perhaps this life wasn't finished with them yet. The following weeks were a blur of activity as the sisters established themselves in San Antonio. Nora secured a position at Beaumont's Fine Goods, where her skilled needlework quickly made her valuable to the shop's owner. Abigail enrolled in Miss Porter's school for young ladies, thriving in the academic environment she had been denied since their mother's death. They settled into a routine work and school during the day, quiet evenings in their room or in Mrs. Hoffman's parlor with the other boarders. On Sundays, they attended services at the local church, gradually building connections within the community. Slowly, the haunted look faded from Abigail's eyes, replaced by the natural enthusiasm of youth. She made friends at school, brought home good reports from her teachers, and began to speak of the future with excitement rather than dread. Nora, too, found a measure of peace in their new life. The constant fear that had been her companion for so long receded as weeks passed with no sign of Vernon. She worked hard, saved what she could, and began to plan for a more permanent home, perhaps a small cottage on the outskirts of town where she and Abigail could have more space and privacy than the boarding house allowed. Yet beneath the surface of her growing contentment ran a current of wistfulness that she couldn't entirely suppress. At odd moments, when a tall man with dark hair passed on the street, or when she heard a deep laugh that echoed with familiar timbre, her thoughts would fly back to the cabin near Jefferson and the man who had risked so much to help them. Ross's letter of introduction had proven valuable. Thomas Jenkins, the dry goods merchant, had welcomed them warmly and helped spread word of Nora's skill with a needle, bringing additional sewing work that supplemented her income from the shop. He invited them for Sunday dinner occasionally, treating them with avuncular kindness that gradually drew out the full story of their escape from Vernon. Ross always did have a soft heart beneath that stoic exterior. Jenkins remarked one evening after hearing how Ross had sheltered them. Known him since he was a boy, riding with his father to bring horses to market. Not surprised he stepped in to help when you needed it. Have you heard from him recently? Nora asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Jenkins shook his head. Not for several months. He's not one for regular correspondence. Comes through San Antonio once or twice a year on horse business, stays a few days, then heads back to that ranch of his. He studied Nora's face with perceptive eyes. He made quite an impression on you, didn't he? Nora felt her cheeks warm. He saved our lives. I'm naturally grateful. Jenkins murmured, clearly unconvinced but tactful enough not to press further. Well, when I next hear from him, I'll be sure to let him know you're both doing well. By October, 2 months after their arrival in San Antonio, the sisters had saved enough to move from Mrs. Hoffman's boarding house to a small 2-room apartment above a bakery on the west side of town. The space was modest, but entirely their own, a luxury after years of living under Vernon's roof and then in the communal environment of the boarding house. Nora took pride in making the apartment a true home, sewing curtains and cushions in cheerful fabrics, arranging their few possessions with care. Each item they acquired: a chair found at a second-hand shop, dishes purchased with Nora's first full wages. A small bookshelf Jenkins had given them represented another step toward the stable life she had dreamed of during those dark days with Vernon. One evening in early November, as Nora sat by their small stove mending a tear in one of Abigail's school dresses, her sister looked up from her homework with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever wonder what happened to Ross?" she asked suddenly. The question caught Nora off guard. They rarely spoke of Ross or their journey from Jefferson, as if the memories were too precious or too painful to examine directly. Sometimes, Nora admitted, her needle pausing in its work. "I hope he's well." "I miss him," Abigail said simply. "He was kind to us when we needed kindness most." Nora nodded, unable to express the more complex emotions that Ross's memory evoked in her. "Yes, he was. Do you think we'll ever see him again?" Abigail persisted. "He has our address. He could visit if he wanted to." "San Antonio is a long way from Jefferson," Nora reminded her gently. "And he has his ranch to run. His life is there." Abigail sighed, returning to her books. "I know, it's just, he felt like family somehow, even though we only knew him for a few days." Family, the word echoed in Nora's heart. Yes, Ross had felt like family, or what family should be. Protective, supportive, kind. The sort of man their father had been, the sort of man Vernon had pretended to be when courting their mother. That night, after Abigail was asleep, Nora took out the envelope Ross had given her before they parted. Inside was the letter of introduction to Jenkins, which had served its purpose, and a slip of paper with the address of Ross's ranch near Jefferson. She had memorized it long ago but kept the paper nonetheless, a tangible connection to him. Should she write? The question had haunted her for weeks. What would she say? A simple thank you seemed inadequate for all he had done. And if she wrote, what response did she hope for? What could possibly come of renewing their connection when hundreds of miles separated them? Yet the desire to reach out, to bridge the distance somehow, grew stronger with each passing day. Finally, in late November, Nora sat down at their small table and composed a letter. "Dear Mr. Emerson, I hope this letter finds you well. Abigail and I have settled in San Antonio and are building a good life here, thanks in no small part to your kindness and assistance. Your friend Mr. Jenkins has been most helpful, providing work connections and much appreciated advice as we navigate our new surroundings. Abigail is attending school and flourishing in her studies. Her teachers speak highly of her intelligence and diligence. I have secured a position at a shop that specializes in ladies' fashions and millinery, where my sewing skills are well utilized and fairly compensated. We have modest but comfortable lodgings above a bakery in a respectable neighborhood. We often think of the courage and selflessness you showed in helping 2 strangers at considerable risk to yourself. Such generosity of spirit is rare in this world, and we count ourselves fortunate beyond measure to have encountered it when we needed it most. I hope your ranch and horse breeding endeavors are prospering." Abigail asks about your horses occasionally, having developed an interest in them during our brief stay at your cabin. If your business should ever bring you to San Antonio, we would be honored to offer you a meal and proper thanks for all you did for us. With deepest gratitude, Nora Lawson. She included their address at the bottom of the page, then carefully folded and sealed the letter. The next day, she posted it at the mail office in town, watching as it was sorted into the northbound delivery. Whether Ross would respond or whether the letter would even reach him, she couldn't know. But she had reached out, and that small action lifted a weight she hadn't fully acknowledged until it was gone. Life continued its steady rhythm as winter settled over San Antonio. The holiday season brought special orders at the shop, keeping Nora busy with elaborate gowns and accessories for the social events that filled the calendar of the city's prominent families. Abigail threw herself into preparations for her school's Christmas pageant, practicing her lines as an angel with determined focus. On Christmas Eve, they attended a special service at church, then returned to their apartment for a modest but festive dinner. They had decorated a small pine tree with paper ornaments Abigail had made at school and strings of dried berries. Beneath it lay a few carefully wrapped presents, a new coat for Abigail that Nora had saved for weeks to purchase, and a hand-embroidered handkerchief Abigail had made for Nora in her sewing class. As they sat by the stove after dinner, sipping hot cocoa and admiring their tree, a knock sounded at their door. Puzzled, they weren't expecting visitors, and Mrs. Hoffman's annual Christmas gathering for her former boarders wasn't until the following day Nora went to answer it. She opened the door to find Thomas Jenkins standing in the hallway, a wrapped package in his hands and an oddly excited expression on his face. "Mr. Jenkins," she greeted him with surprise. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, Miss Lawson," he replied. "I hope I'm not intruding on your evening." "Not at all," Nora assured him, stepping back to allow him entry. "Please come in, we're just enjoying the quiet." Jenkins entered, nodding warmly to Abigail, who had risen from her chair. "I've brought a small gift for you both," he said, presenting the package. "And some news I think you'll want to hear." "News?" Nora echoed, accepting the package with thanks. Jenkins smiled, his eyes twinkling with suppressed excitement. "I had a visitor at my store yesterday, a friend from up north who's in town on business. He asked most particularly about two sisters who might have arrived in San Antonio some months back." Nora's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead. "Who?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. "Ross Emerson," Jenkins confirmed. "Looking remarkably well for a man who's just traveled hundreds of miles in winter weather." Abigail gasped, her eyes lighting up. "Ross is here, in San Antonio," Jenkins nodded, clearly enjoying their reaction. "Arrived yesterday with 6 fine horses to sell at the livestock auction. Said he received a certain letter that made the journey seem worthwhile." Nora sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. "Where is he now?" "Staying at the hotel on Commerce Street," Jenkins replied. "He asked if you might be willing to receive him tomorrow, said he didn't want to intrude on your Christmas Eve, but I thought you might want to know right away that he's here." "Yes," Nora said faintly. "Thank you." Jenkins stayed only a few minutes more, declining their offer of cocoa with the explanation that his wife was waiting. As he left, he paused at the door. "Ross Emerson is a good man, Miss Lawson," he said quietly. "One of the best I know. And I haven't seen him look at anyone the way he looked when he asked about you." After he left, the sisters stared at each other in stunned silence for a moment before Abigail broke into a delighted laugh. "He came. I knew he would eventually," she exclaimed. "He's here on business," Nora cautioned, trying to temper both Abigail's excitement and her own suddenly racing heart. "The livestock auction is one of the largest in the region. It's natural he would come." Abigail rolled her eyes with the exasperation only a 16-year-old could muster. "Nora, he could have sent those horses with a handler. He came himself because he wanted to see you." "Us," Nora corrected automatically, "to see how we're doing, if that's what you need to tell yourself," Abigail replied with surprising perception. She crossed to their small wardrobe. "What will you wear tomorrow?" "The blue dress. I think it brings out your eyes." Despite her attempts to remain practical, Nora found herself caught up in Abigail's excitement. They spent the next hour planning what they would serve for dinner, their best dishes, supplemented by a Christmas cake from the bakery downstairs, and how they would arrange their modest apartment to receive their special guest. That night, sleep eluded Nora entirely. She lay awake, listening to Abigail's steady breathing from the other side of the room, her mind filled with questions and possibilities. Why had Ross really come? What did it mean? And most importantly, what did she want it to mean? The feelings she had carefully contained for months now surged to the surface, impossible to ignore. In the quiet darkness of Christmas Eve, Nora finally admitted to herself what her heart had known since those days in the abandoned Miller farmhouse. She cared for Ross Emerson far more deeply than mere gratitude could explain, but what of his feelings? He had traveled hundreds of miles in winter, true, but perhaps only out of concern for their welfare or a sense of responsibility toward those he had helped. To hope for more seemed foolish, yet hope bloomed nonetheless, a Christmas gift she hadn't dared to wish for. Morning brought a flurry of activity. The sisters attended church, then hurried home to prepare for their visitor. Nora wore the blue dress as Abigail had suggested, and Abigail put on her Christmas best, a green wool dress with white collar that made her look older than her 16 years. At precisely 2 o'clock, a knock sounded at their door. Nora took a deep breath, smoothed her dress, and went to answer it. Ross Emerson stood in the hallway, hat in hand, looking somehow both exactly as she remembered and entirely different. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, his clothes of better quality than the work clothes he'd worn at the ranch, but his blue eyes held the same steady warmth she recalled from those days that seemed so long ago. "Miss Lawson," he greeted her, his voice sending a ripple of recognition through her. "Merry Christmas." "Mr. Emerson," she replied, suddenly shy. "Please come in." He stepped inside, and the small apartment seemed to shrink around his tall frame. Abigail flew across the room to embrace him, propriety forgotten in her joy at seeing him again. "You came," she exclaimed. "We've missed you so much," Ross laughed, returning her embrace before setting her gently aside. "I've missed you too, Miss Abigail. You're looking well. San Antonio must agree with you." "It does," Abigail confirmed happily. "I'm doing excellently in school, and Nora's the best seamstress at Mrs. Beaumont's shop, and we have this whole apartment to ourselves." Ross smiled at her enthusiasm, then turned back to Nora, his expression growing more serious. "You look well too," he said quietly. "I'm glad to see it." "Thank you," Nora replied, finding her composure. "We are well." "Please sit down. We've prepared dinner, though it's nothing fancy." The initial awkwardness soon faded as they shared the meal. Ross told them about his journey south, about the horses he had brought to auction, about changes in Marshall since they'd left. He carefully avoided any mention of Vernon or Jefferson, for which Nora was grateful. In turn, the sisters shared stories of their new life, Abigail's school accomplishments, Nora's work at the shop, the community they were slowly building around themselves. The conversation flowed easily, as if the months of separation had never happened. After dinner, Abigail insisted on showing Ross the small courtyard behind the bakery, where the owner allowed tenants to sit on pleasant days. Her transparent attempt to give Nora and Ross a moment alone might have been amusing if Nora hadn't been so nervous about what might be said in that privacy. When Abigail had darted out the door, Ross turned to Nora, his expression unreadable. "Your letter surprised me," he said. "I didn't expect to hear from you." "I wanted you to know we were safe," Nora explained, "that your help had made a difference." Ross nodded, moving to the window to look out at the street below. "I'm glad to hear it. After you left, I often wondered how you were faring." A silence fell between them, filled with unspoken questions. Finally, Nora gathered her courage. "Mr. Emerson Ross," she began, the use of his given name feeling both strange and right. "I have to ask, why did you come all this way? The livestock auction can't be the only reason." He turned to face her, his blue eyes direct and honest. "No, it's not the only reason, not even the main reason." He took a deep breath. "I came because I couldn't stop thinking about you, because after you left, my cabin felt emptier than it ever had before. because every time I rode past the Miller place, I remembered sitting by the fire with you and feeling like I'd found something I didn't know I was looking for." The words hung in the air, a declaration more heartfelt than any Nora had ever received. Her pulse quickened as Ross continued. "I know it may seem foolish, we barely know each other. You have a life here now, a good one that you've built through your own courage and determination. I have no right to disrupt that." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of uncertainty at odds with his usual confidence. "But when your letter came, I had to see you, to know if what I felt during those few days was real or just a product of unusual circumstances." "And," Nora asked softly, hardly daring to breathe, "what did you discover?" Ross's gaze held hers, unwavering. "That it was real is real. That I care for you, Nora Lawson, more deeply than I thought possible in so short an acquaintance." Joy blossomed in Nora's heart, bright as the winter sun outside. "I feel the same," she admitted. "I've tried to be practical, to focus on building our life here, but my thoughts keep returning to you, to your kindness, your courage, your quiet strength." Ross crossed the room in 2 strides, taking her hands in his. "I'm not asking for promises," he said earnestly. "I know your priority is Abigail and the life you're creating here, but I'd like the chance to court you properly, to see if what began between us might grow into something lasting." "What of your ranch?" Nora asked, practical concerns intruding despite her happiness. "Your life is in Jefferson, hundreds of miles from here. A ranch can be sold," Ross said simply. "There's good land near San Antonio, or if you preferred, Abigail could finish her schooling here and then join us elsewhere." He squeezed her hands gently. "What matters is not where we are, but that we're together, if that's what you want." The future opened before Nora like a road stretching toward the horizon, uncertain but full of promise. After years of making decisions based solely on survival and necessity, the opportunity to choose based on her heart's desire felt almost overwhelming. "I would like that very much," she said finally. "The chance to know you better, to see where this might lead." The smile that illuminated Ross's face was like sunrise after the longest night. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. They were interrupted by the sound of the door opening as Abigail returned from the courtyard, her cheeks flushed from the winter air. She took in the scene before her, Ross and Nora standing close together, hands still joined, and a knowing smile spread across her face. "Finally," she declared with the confidence of youth. "I was wondering how long it would take you both to realize what was obvious to everyone else." Ross laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "And what was obvious, Miss Abigail?" "That you belong together, of course," she replied matter-of-factly. "From the moment you opened your cabin door to us, I knew you were meant to be part of our family." Family. The word resonated through Nora's heart, filling empty spaces she hadn't realized were there. That night in the abandoned Miller farmhouse, Ross had spoken of his dream for a real family, not the broken thing he had grown up with. She and Abigail had been searching for the same, not just safety and stability, but the deeper sense of belonging that comes from being truly loved. "Is that what we are?" Ross asked softly. "A family, not yet," Nora replied, her heart too full for anything but honesty, "but perhaps with time and care we could be." Outside, snow began to fall, a rare occurrence in San Antonio, especially on Christmas Day. The 3 of them moved to the window to watch the delicate flakes drift down from a pewter sky, transforming the familiar street into something magical and new. As they stood there together, Nora felt a peace settle over her that she hadn't known since before her mother died. The future held no guarantees. There would be challenges to overcome, decisions to make, a courtship to navigate with all its uncertainties. But for the first time in years, she looked forward with hope rather than fear. From that desperate night when they had fled Vernon's house, through the unlikely sanctuary of Ross's cabin, to this quiet Christmas moment in San Antonio, their journey had been one of both physical distance and emotional healing. The road ahead might still hold unexpected turns, but they would travel it together, no longer fleeing from danger, but moving toward the promise of love, family, and home. Spring came early to San Antonio in 1876, bringing with it a profusion of wildflowers that carpeted the hills surrounding the growing city. For Nora and Abigail Lawson, the changing season marked not just the anniversary of their arrival, but the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. Ross had remained in San Antonio after Christmas, extending his stay from the originally planned few days to weeks, then months. He rented rooms above Jenkins's store and found work at the livery stable while researching available properties in the surrounding countryside. Every Sunday, he joined the sisters for dinner in their apartment, and twice weekly he escorted Nora on proper courtship outings, walks along the river, attendance at church socials, occasional visits to the small theater that had opened on the main square. By March, what had begun as tentative affection had blossomed into deep and certain love. Ross proposed on a bright Sunday afternoon as they walked through a meadow thick with bluebonnets. His speech was simple and heartfelt, without flowery declarations, but with the honest emotion that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. "I love you, Nora," he said, taking her hands in his as they stood surrounded by the sea of blue flowers. "I love your strength, your determination, your tender heart beneath that practical exterior. I want to build a life with you to create the family we both dreamed of but never thought we'd find. Will you marry me?" Nora's yes was immediate and certain, her heart too full for hesitation. The kiss that followed sealed promises that needed no elaborate vows to bind them. Abigail's delight at the news was boundless. At 16, she had become a beautiful young woman with their mother's gentle eyes and a confidence born of security and love. She threw herself into wedding preparations with enthusiasm, offering opinions on everything from Nora's dress to the cake. Mrs. Hoffman insisted on baking for the occasion. April brought the wedding, a simple ceremony in the church they had come to consider their own. The congregation was small but warm friends they had made in San Antonio, including Julia Parker and the Jenkins family, Mrs. Hoffman and several of her boarders, Nora's colleagues from the shop, and Abigail's teachers and closest school friends. Nora wore a dress of ivory silk she had designed and sewn herself, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had once belonged to her mother. Abigail stood beside her as maid of honor, radiant in pale blue. And waiting at the altar, his eyes never leaving Nora's face as she walked down the aisle, was Ross, the man who had given them sanctuary when they needed it most, and who now offered the promise of a lifetime's protection and love. Their vows were traditional, but spoken with such conviction that many in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was both tender and triumphant, a moment of perfect happiness that neither had believed possible during the darker times of their past. The celebration afterward was held in the garden behind Mrs. Hoffman's boarding house, decorated with paper lanterns and spring flowers. There was music from a local fiddler, dancing on the lawn, and more food than the small gathering could possibly consume. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Ross and Nora circulated among their guests, accepting congratulations and good wishes for their future together. "I always knew you two were meant for each other," Mrs. Caldwell declared when they reached her. The widow from Marshall had traveled all the way to San Antonio for the wedding, bringing with her the same quiet wisdom that had helped them during their flight from Jefferson. "Did you?" Ross asked with a smile, his arm secure around Nora's waist. "Even when we only stayed at your boarding house for one night," Mrs. Caldwell's eyes twinkled. "Especially then, the way you looked at her when you thought no one was watching, like she was the answer to a question you'd been asking all your life." Nora leaned into her husband's embrace, warmth spreading through her at the truth of the widow's observation. From those first frightening hours at Ross's cabin to this moment of perfect joy, their connection had grown from fragile trust to unshakable love, a love strong enough to heal past wounds and build a future neither had dared to imagine. That future began on a piece of land 10 miles outside San Antonio, a small ranch Ross had purchased with the proceeds from selling his property near Jefferson. The house was modest but sturdy, with room to expand as their family grew. A barn housed Ross's prized horses, the foundation of the breeding business he planned to establish. And behind the house, a garden plot awaited Nora's touch, ready to provide vegetables for their table and flowers for their windowsills. They moved in a week after the wedding, with Abigail joining them on weekends while continuing her studies at Miss Porter's during the week. The arrangement allowed her the benefits of education while still being part of their new family unit, a compromise that satisfied everyone's needs and wishes. Their first months of marriage were filled with the joyful work of creating a home together. Ross taught Nora to ride properly, a skill she had never mastered in her previous life. Nora, in turn, transformed the bare rooms of the house into comfortable living spaces, sewing curtains and quilts, arranging furniture to best advantage, filling bookshelves with volumes they all enjoyed. In July, a letter arrived bearing the postmark of Jefferson. Nora's hands trembled as she broke the seal, fearing news of Vernon despite the distance and time that separated them from their former life. Instead, she found a brief note from Sheriff Duncan. "Mrs. Emerson, I write to inform you that Vernon Blackwell was killed in a bar fight last night. Witnesses state he provoked the incident after heavy drinking. As his only known relatives, you and your sister may have claim to his property. Please advise if you wish to pursue this matter. Respectfully, Sheriff J." Duncan. Nora sat on the porch steps, the letter loose in her fingers, as a complex wave of emotions washed through her relief that Vernon could never threaten them again. A strange hollowness at the ignoble end of the man her mother had once loved, and finally, a sense of closure that allowed the last lingering shadows of fear to dissipate in the bright Texas sunlight. Ross found her there an hour later, returning from working with the horses. He sat beside her, listening without judgment as she shared the news and her conflicted response to it. "We won't claim anything," she decided finally. "Let the past remain in the past. We have everything we need right here." Ross's arm around her shoulders was warm and secure. "Are you certain it might be Abigail's inheritance?" "Abigail has a trust from our father that will mature when she turns 18, Nora explained, "and she has us. Vernon's possessions are tainted with too many painful memories." Ross nodded, understanding as always. "Then we close that chapter completely, no looking back." That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Nora reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the desperate flight through the night with Abigail, to the sanctuary of Ross's cabin, to the new life they were building together, each step had been necessary to reach this place of peace and love. "What are you thinking?" Ross asked softly, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "About how sometimes the worst moments in life lead to the best," she replied. "If Vernon hadn't become so violent that night, we would never have fled. If we hadn't fled, we would never have found your cabin. If we hadn't found you." "Fate works in mysterious ways," Ross murmured, drawing her closer. "Though I wish you hadn't had to suffer to find your way to me." "The suffering makes the joy sweeter," Nora said, wisdom born of experience shaping her words, "and I would endure it all again to end up here with you." In the years that followed, their happiness only deepened. Ross's horse breeding business thrived, attracting buyers from across Texas and beyond. Nora continued to sew, creating garments on commission for San Antonio's leading families while managing their growing household. Abigail graduated from Miss Porter's with honors and went on to teach at the very same school, her childhood dream realized through her sister's sacrifices and determination. Their family expanded too. In the spring of 1877, Nora gave birth to a son they named James, after Ross's father. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, Elizabeth, called Ellie, with her mother's determined spirit and her father's blue eyes. The children grew strong and happy on the ranch, surrounded by horses and open spaces, secure in the love of parents who had fought hard for the right to build a family on their own terms. On a warm evening in 1885, as they sat on the porch watching 9-year-old James and 7-year-old Ellie chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Ross took Nora's hand in his, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their years together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you and Abigail had chosen a different direction that night?" he asked. "If you'd gone west instead of east, or stayed on the main road instead of cutting through the woods near my cabin?" Nora looked at their entwined fingers, his hand weathered from years of working with horses, her slightly calloused from needle and thread, both bearing the marks of lives fully lived. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I look at our children, at the home we've built, at the love we share, and I know that somehow we would have found each other eventually." She leaned against his shoulder, content in the certainty of her words. Some things are simply meant to be. As the Texas twilight deepened around them, their children's laughter filling the air, Nora Emerson gave silent thanks for the journey that had led her from darkness into light, from a desperate flight through the night to the enduring sanctuary of true love. The road had not always been easy, but every step had led her home.